This is from Reflections on a Ravaged Century by Robert Conquest, published in the year 2000. And this is from Chapter 9, Missiles and Mindsets. The Cold War continues. 1. The period between Stalin's death in 1953 and the emergence of the Brezhnev regime in 1964 saw continued progress in Soviet armaments. The detonation of the first deliverable hydrogen bomb in 1953, the launching of the first satellite in 1957, the latter marking the achievement of an intercontinental ballistic missile. The satellite launch, followed by other Soviet space achievements, had a major propaganda effect. There was a strong impression that the Soviet Union deployed a superior science and technology. And this was, of course, mistakenly thought to have produced a missile gap in which the United States was outgunned, though in fact the Soviet Union had not really caught up in terms of effective deployment. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was, in this context, an attempt to outflank America's general superiority. The Soviet retreat was accompanied by much, though unpublicized, comment in Moscow military and political circles to the effect that the USSR would never again be caught in a position of weakness. The period that ensued and that only ended in the Soviet collapse at the end of the 1980s saw the continuity of the totalitarian mindset. In one sense, the Soviet leaders, especially after Khrushchev's fall, were not red-hot ideologists. On the other hand, their minds were such that they had no other way of conceiving or even justifying their role. Even if doubts had entered one or another mind, as however minimally and vaguely they seemed to have entered Khrushchev's, they could barely find expression. His successors were men who, unlike Khrushchev and his generation, had had no experience whatever of pre-Soviet times. They were all mere products of the apparatus. They had no other way of thinking. Their view of the world remained that of sectarian hostility to all other sources of political ideas and technical power, and an almost ineradicable conviction that struggle on a world scale was their historical mission. Tactics and the assessment of opportunity varied with Marxist assessments of the balance of forces. So in the mid-1960s, the time when Stalin had in fact foreseen that the USSR would be in a position to have another go, we entered the second main phase of the Cold War, on which we shall go into more detail. For it is at about this time that a decision seems to have been made in the Kremlin to take on the West in armaments and on a world scale. The expression offensive against the positions of imperialism began to appear regularly in the Soviet press in 1965. The first use of the phrase seems to have been by Brezhnev in an address to the Congress of the Romanian Communist Party on the 20th of July, 1965, when he noted that some years ago the communist parties had already concluded that the relation of forces had shifted in their favor, and that in the meantime this had reached such a stage that the progressive forces are now on the offensive. The call for this offensive was formalized in the manifesto of the Communist parties in November. Pravda, 20th of November, 1965. As to the scope of Soviet ambitions, in June 1968, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko flatly asserted in his speech to the Supreme Soviet, "The Soviet Union is a great power situated on two continents, Europe and Asia, but the range of our country's international interests is not determined by its geographical position alone. The Soviet people do not plead with anybody to be allowed to have their say in the solution of any question involving the maintenance of international peace, concerning the freedom and independence of the people, and our country's extensive interests. During any acute situation, however far away it appears from our country, the Soviet Union's reaction is to be expected in all capitals of the world." Though, of course, equivalent Western reaction to events in Poland was illegitimate. One would have thought Gromyko's claim to a place in the sun was unequivocal. Yet some Westerners extracted a fairly harmless intent from it. They argued that all Gromyko urged, and so all the Soviet Union wanted, was the status of a global power co-equal with the United States. On this argument, the Soviet Union for decades put in an enormous effort and overstrained its economy for the right to have its opinion listened to in discussion of world problems. And if we interpret it as meaning that the Kremlin simply wanted a half share with the West in every sphere, it remained nonsense. Were we really to envisage a peaceable world in which every country was ruled by a stable coalition of communists and Democrats, or alternate countries that were communist and non-communist, with no attempt to spread the power of the former into the latter? End there on page 168.